Good morning. This is Attorney Vince Davis, and we are doing office hours this morning. Okay, this is April 8th, 2005, and this morning I want to start off with an article. Actually, it was a video on YouTube that I saw. It was on a news station in Georgia, and it was a story about I think in February of this year, 2025, an article about U.S. Senator Ossoff. He's a Democrat from Georgia, but he was talking about some bipartisan legislation that he tried to introduce last year, and it didn't get off the Senate floor. And I'm talking about the United States Senate. And he is trying to introduce a bill this year that would incentivize states who record CPS interviews. Remember the other day I said there are two reforms that could be made right now that would drastically improve the CPS system in terms of fairness and protection of rights? I said one would be the recording of interviews by CPS agents or CPS social workers. And his bill that he has introduced would incentivize CPS states or states that required their CPS workers to record either audio or video CPS interviews of children and adults. Now, what's important is a lot of emphasis is putting on the interviews of children, and less emphasis is being put on the interview of adults, which I'm more concerned about, probably equally concerned about. Anyway, the best way to sell that type of legislation is to focus on interviews of children. Everyone's concerned about children. I'm concerned about children, but I'm also concerned about the rights of parents. So this story, if you want to Google it, occurred on the news in Georgia. I think it was WTOC in late February, I think 26, 2025. So if you want to Google it and watch the clip for yourself. But my question is, why don't they record now? As I said, we need these protections, these state protections and federal protections, because jury trials and the recording of videos is the only way we can ensure people's rights are protected. And I say people, I don't mean just children. I don't mean just adults. I'm talking about people. Now, just yesterday, a young man called me. He's 26 years old. He's from Northern California. And he told me a story about when he and his younger brother and his younger sister, who are all adults now, were in foster care. And he told me a story about how he and his siblings were physically and sexually abused while they were in the foster home. And I asked him, did he ever mention it to the social worker? And he said, yes, that they had talked to the social worker about it. And he said he specifically talked to his attorney about it, the attorney in the CPS case. And the attorney only told him, don't worry, everything will be all right. He remembers being moved to another foster home, but he said he doesn't think anybody ever told the CPS judge about what happened to him and his siblings. And he wanted to know, and he was calling on behalf of the siblings as well, if he and his siblings could do anything. And I told him that yes, that he, especially for the sexual abuse, he and his siblings could still, file some type of litigation to recoup for their injuries in federal or state court, because California did something very interesting several years ago. They have increased the number of years before the statute of limitation expires for certain types of, well, for sexual abuse, maybe even for physical abuse. I have to research that, but definitely for sexual abuse. And I think there may be even some special rules about children who are in foster care. Now, what's interesting enough that the social worker did not recommend or refer these children to legal counsel. Apparently, their own legal counsel didn't refer them to legal counsel to pursue their legal rights for being abused in foster care. So I sent out paperwork for him and his siblings yesterday to review so that we might be able to start investigating what went on, get a copy of the file up there in Northern California to see exactly what happened and to see if legal rights or a legal case can be pursued. And this is one of the reasons why I think social workers in counties don't want to record interviews. Because if you record interviews, it's very hard to sweep something under the rug, right? It comes to light. It's a permanent record of abuse that happens in these CPS systems. So these counties and these social workers don't want to be sued. Why would they ever want to record these terrible things that happen to children in foster care? The other reason why I think CPS social workers in counties don't want to record the interviews of parents is because I think it would lead to losses of CPS cases in the CPS courtroom. For example, if a social worker interviews a witness and the witness says ABC, but the social worker needs the witness to say BCD, the social worker can just write in the report, well, the witness said ABC. And, a lot of times when they write that in the report, the judge and the attorneys take that to be gospel. And that witness is never brought into court, never cross examined, never challenged upon the social worker's report is never challenged. I remember once I did a trial, and I've talked about this before. The social worker's report said that the child's therapist, and this is before the case started, the child's therapist said ABC. And my client kept telling me, Mr. Davis, the social worker I know never would have said that. And I was kind of like, well, do you think the social worker would make that big a lie about it? And my client kept telling me, well, I finally had to call the therapist and I said, hey, I just want to ask you, did you tell the social worker ABC? No, Mr. Davis, I never told the social worker that. I said, did you ever text the social worker that? Did you ever email the social worker that? No, Mr. Davis, I never communicated with the social worker. I go, what do you mean you never communicated? She says, I've never met, talked to, or communicated with in any fashion the social worker. And I said, well, if the social worker wrote in a report that you said ABC, that would be false? She goes, yeah, that would be false. Not only did that statement show up in the original detention report, but it was then repeated in the jurisdictional and dispositional report by a second social worker who claimed she verified that statement. So I subpoenaed in the witness who testified, I've never talked to any social worker from CPS. I never said that statement that the child told me ABC, and it's false. First of all, the child never said that to me. And secondly, I've never told any social worker from this county that the child said that. Now, what if, I don't subpoena in that therapist to tell the judge that what the social worker reported was false? Well, the judge and the social worker are going to the judge and the attorneys are going to take what the social worker said as gospel. So it's important. And these are the reasons why interviews, I think, aren't tape recorded. When CPS starts losing cases in the CPS court, that means they lose funding. They bring less cases to court and they lose funding because funding is based upon the number of cases they bring and ultimately win. You know, they're a government agency. So they're given money from the federal government based upon their budget. And, I've been telling people over the years that the budget for CPS in Los Angeles County is in excess of $2 billion. And this morning, when I was preparing for this show, I thought, well, you know what? $2 billion is a lot of money. Where did I get that number from? I've been saying that number for so long, I couldn't remember where I got that number from. So I Googled it. Well, actually, I went to ChatGPT and I ChatGPT'd it. And ChatGPT told me, well, it's $2.8 billion plus for Los Angeles County CPS. And I said, well, wait a minute. ChatGPT is not always right. So I went to Google. Google knows all, supposedly. And I Googled it. What Google says, well, it's $2.8 billion plus. And it referenced me to county records. And I went to the county records. What did the county records say? $2.8 billion. Now, I don't know if you know how much money $2.8 billion is, but if you started counting today, you wouldn't reach 1 billion before you died. And their budget is $2.8 billion. And they're not trying to reduce that budget. They're not trying to lose cases. So why in the world would they want to tape record or video record interviews with children and parents when it would benefit children and parents in litigation? It would not benefit the social worker in any fashion. So that legislation that Senator Ossoff is trying to pass, it's a good first step to incentivize states where social workers tape record interviews with children and parents. But why don't we just force or require the states, as a condition to receive federal money, that they have to record interviews of children and parents? Seems easy enough. The police have to do it. Lawsuits of police abuse got so bad that most police departments now require their police officers to wear a camera, a body cam. These days, police recordings are so cheap and so easy to do. Technology has gotten, so cheap that it's easy to wear that body camera. Why don't we require social workers to do it? I don't know. That's a very good question. I can tell you time and time again, I talk to people every day who tell me, the social worker wrote in the report ABC, and I didn't say ABC. I said CDE, or I said, in a lot of cases, I said XYZ. How did the social worker write ABC? And I tell people, well, you're expecting a government worker, because he or she is a government worker, that they're going to be fair and reasonable. Unfortunately or fortunately, we live in America, and, there's that old thing about follow the money. Yesterday, I spoke to a relative who lives in another state, and her niece and nephew are here in California, and she's trying to get custody of the niece and nephew here in California. And apparently, the aunt and her husband are fine, upstanding citizens in Colorado. I think she told me she was a nurse and her husband's a fireman. Do tell. And the social worker here has told them, allegedly, straight out, that you're not going to get the children. They're in some foster home with non-relatives, and you're not going to get those children. And she asked me how that could happen and why that's happening. And, I told her I couldn't be sure how that's happening or why that's happening, but I could speculate. And my speculation is the federal money follows the kid. If these kids are shipped off to Colorado, the county in California won't receive the funding for that child or will receive less funding for that child. So nobody wants to send the child to Colorado or the children to Colorado. Anyway, I told her what she should do because the social workers, I say this many times, the social workers do not make the decisions in this case. They don't. They make recommendations, they don't make the decisions. And if you don't challenge their recommendations by going to court, making the appropriate motion, filing the appropriate petition, it is the judge in each case that makes the final decision. The judge, not the social worker. So, in a lot of cases, the social worker will decide, well, I'm not going to place the child with you. And a lot of relatives scratch their head and say, okay, I'll just live with that. What the relative should do is go to court with an attorney, file the appropriate motions and petitions, and ask the judge to place the child with you because it's the judge's ultimate decision. Likewise, if you're a parent and you ask the social worker for something and the social worker doesn't want to give it to you, like more visitation, unmonitored visitation, weekends and overnights, talk to your attorney, file the appropriate motions and paperwork and petitions to get that extra visitation. If the evidence is there, the judge may order it, even though the social worker doesn't recommend it. I've seen it happen many, 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 many times. So, but make sure you have the evidence because if you don't, the judge will probably agree with the social worker and not give you that additional visitation or overnights. In my research this morning, I noticed something, and I've seen it before, but it was really highlighted in my mind this morning. It's not new, but all the stories about CPS talk about the victims being children. And of course, it reminds me of my first boss out of law school told me. He was one of the best trial attorneys in town. And he told me, judges and juries only like children, victims, and animals. He said, that's what people like. He says, now, if you can't fit your client in one of those, you have a problem. Well, I don't represent any animals, so that's out. I rarely represent children unless it's in a civil rights case, so that's out. In CPS cases, I represent parents. So, somehow you got to spin it for them to be victims. And a lot of times that's not hard to do. But I noticed that a lot of the news stories don't portray children, parents as victims, and they are victims. It seems no one cares about the parents as much as they care about the children. So I decided I wanted to do two things, and I'm going to need the help and volunteers of all of you watching and of all the past hosts that I've used or have been on this platform. So Bob, Darren, Deidre, Miss G, Aaron, and all the other past and present hosts and viewers of this show and of this platform, if you're watching. First, I'd like to start a monthly magazine, digital magazine, devoted to parents. And it's going to highlight one or two of the most egregious stories of parental abuse by CPS social workers against a parent. These cases will be reported by our platform to local, state, and federal politicians and authorities. Authorities meaning the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice. These reports will be followed up on a monthly basis and reported each month in our magazine. This monthly magazine may develop into a weekly or a monthly show on YouTube or on Facebook. I've even come up with a name. I won't tell you the name until I buy the website or buy that domain name from GoDaddy later on today. Many years ago, one of the first shows I started on this platform was called CPS, The Horror Stories. And I was the first host of that show. And then the next host was a former client, a woman by the name of Leslie Clark. And since then, there have been a couple of very, very good hosts. And it was a popular show, and the show was about parents who had horror stories of being involved with CPS. But over the years, I noticed that the show had a shortcoming. And the shortcoming was this: many, many parents were afraid to come on the show. A lot of you don't know that because me talking to the parents or my producer, Grace, talking to the parents, they were afraid of retaliation. Something that I really didn't consider when I started this show. You know, they were afraid of retaliation by judges, by social workers, by lawyers involved in the case, and even by the foster parents, because a lot of times people would have complaints about foster parents. And in one instance, I don't know if I've ever talked about this before, but I was doing a case in Northern California. And on my first appearance, I was verbally attacked by the county council in that case before the case started and on the record. I was attacked for being a host of the show and having a platform complaining about CPS. Go figure. And, you know, the county council in California represents the social worker. And in the shows, we never mention names. We never mention names of the social worker. Or the parent would mention their name, of course, which they are allowed to do, but we wouldn't mention the names of the children, of the social worker, or even the attorneys involved, or the judge. We would mention the name of the county sometimes. And if you lived in that county and you saw the parent, you would know who they were talking about on the show. So I was berated by the county council, but the judge, to the judge's credit, reminded the county council that even though the cases were confidential, no names were mentioned. And there was something called the First Amendment. On the way home, on the plane, I started thinking about what the judge said because it blew over and we went on and did the case. I realized that not only had the county council seen this show on social media, but the judge had seen the show. And I realized that it must have a far-reaching impact, more than I thought. Because when I started doing the show, I didn't realize how many people watch this show. And a lot of times I'll go to court and people that I don't know will come up to me and thank me for the videos and for doing the show. And because they have no other resource or not a lot of resources that they can go to get information and to share what's happening with them. So I'm going to revive CPS, The Horror Stories, but with a twist. And that twist is going to be at the request of the guest parent. We are going to black out or blur their face and alter their voice if that's what they want. So that they won't be afraid of retaliation by telling their story. Sometimes we can even change the state they're from or the county that they're from. So if you're a parent and you have had a problem with CPS and it's a horror story, please contact Grace, Grace, at vincentwdavis.com. Let Grace know that you would like to speak to me or to her about being a guest on CPS The Horror Stories, because we are reviving that show. Grace doesn't know that yet. She's not online this morning yet because it's early here in California, but we will be doing that. Now, here's another twist that we're going to have. When the show first ran, it had one host. It was either me, Leslie, or other hosts throughout its life. I'm looking for volunteers. Um, that's volunteers with an S to be the host. And it would be optimal if I had 7 volunteers so that nobody gets burned out on the show. Because one of the things I noticed with the show, and it even happened to me, when the show runs daily and you hear these stories, and some of them are just heart-wrenching stories, you almost get like PTSD from hearing these stories of people going through tragic situations. And the emotional impact takes a toll on you. So I'm looking for at least 7 people to do these shows one time a week. But I want to do the shows 7 days a week because I know there are a lot of people out there, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people who have CPS horror stories that they would like to share or that would benefit other people by sharing of their stories. So if you would like to be a host for one of those stories or for one of those days of the week, please contact Grace, Grace, at vincentwdavis.com and tell her that you would like to volunteer. The deadline for sending that email to Grace to be a volunteer host will be this Friday at midnight. We are going to try to make selections for hosts by this Saturday, and hopefully we can launch the show to start running again by next week. All right. There are some questions. Let me see if there are questions. I can't really. Okay, here's a question in the comments. Does this mean the social workers are deceiving the judges, the mayor, liars, and responsible for innocent children abuse and unfair suffering? Well, I think you're asking a question, and it means that sometimes social workers do not tell the truth. Now, and if Miss G, if you're listening, don't get upset with me. I have come across social workers that have been honest and that write honest reports. The problem becomes that, though, that, I've come across social workers that have not been honest. It reminds me of a lawsuit, a civil rights lawsuit that I did, maybe seems like 6 or 7 years ago. At the deposition, the social worker admitted on the record that she had lied under penalty of perjury. Admitted on the record. That and then basically that was she admitted that she had violated my client's rights, my client's civil rights. That social worker did not get fired. And as a matter of fact, shortly thereafter, I looked her up and she had been promoted to supervisor. I speculate why she was promoted to supervisor. And my speculation is, this is a guess. In that deposition, I asked her, were any of her supervisors involved in the cover up? And she told me very clearly, no, she did it all on her own. Well, I couldn't prove otherwise. And we basically won the case by her own admissions. But I think she fell on the sword and she, they call it, what do they call that? The police call it the blue code of silence. So I think it was the social worker code of silence. Those are just my guesses. I'm speculating, but for a woman to say on the record that she lied under penalty of perjury and then end up getting promoted, hmm, made me say, that was the only thing I could think of. Usually when you lie under penalty of perjury, you're prosecuted for perjury and you're fired, right? Had my client lied under penalty of perjury, they would have thrown her in jail, thrown her under the jail for that matter. Anyway, that's the end of the show today. We're at the past the 30-minute mark. We'll be on tomorrow. Don't forget, if you're interested in being a host on the new CPS The Horror Stories, email grace@vincentwdavis.com. If you want to volunteer for the new magazine, from the parent's perspective, please email grace@vincentwdavis.com. It's going to be a monthly magazine focusing on one or two stories about parents. And if you want to be a guest, of course, and tell your story on CPS The Horror Stories, also email Grace, GRACE, @vincentwdavis.com. All right, everyone. Have a good day, and we'll see you tomorrow at 6:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Bye-bye.